Welcome back to the deep dive. We've got a really interesting audio clip to explore today.
Yeah, this one is fascinating.
It's an excerpt from a lecture by Dr. نیما قربانی,
An Iranian psychologist.
Yeah, and it delves into this whole intersection of culture and psychotherapy.
Which is something we haven't really explored in depth before.
It's specifically focused on the challenges and considerations when you're working with Iranian patients, so kind of a unique perspective.
It is, and I think it highlights some really important points that are relevant even beyond that specific cultural context.
Absolutely. And I think what struck me right away is how Dr. Qurbanī, he goes beyond just like surface level language differences.
Right. It's not just about speaking the same language.
He really emphasizes understanding those deeper cultural nuances.
Those unspoken rules, the values, the behaviors.
Yeah. The things that can really impact how someone interacts in a therapeutic setting, but you might not even be aware of.
Exactly. And he gives this great example of tear-off.
Oh, yeah. I'd never heard of that before.
It's this elaborate custom of politeness and deference in Iranian culture.
Right. And he's saying it can be really confusing for therapists who aren't familiar with it.
They might see it as dishonesty or resistance.
Because it can seem like the person isn't being straightforward.
Right. But within the cultural context, it makes perfect sense.
It really makes you realize how easy it is to misinterpret things.
If you're not coming from that same cultural background.
Absolutely.
And this is where cultural competence becomes so crucial.
For therapists especially.
It's not enough to just have good intentions.
You really need that specific training and understanding to work effectively with people from diverse backgrounds.
Otherwise, you risk misinterpreting their words and actions.
And that could lead to some really harmful misunderstandings.
Exactly.
It's like trying to navigate a new city without a map.
I like that analogy.
You might eventually find your way, but you're going to make a lot of wrong turns.
And miss some important landmarks along the way.
Exactly. And speaking of misinterpretations, Dr. Qurbanī also talks about the MMPI.
The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
Yeah, that's a widely used psychological test.
It's a classic.
But he points out that Iranian patients often score high on the, the lie scale?
Yes, the lie scale.
Can you explain a little bit about what the MMPI is all about and why this is significant?
Sure. So the MMPI is basically a questionnaire designed to assess personality traits and psychopathology.
Okay, so it's trying to get a sense of someone's personality and any potential mental health issues.
Right. And the lie scale is a part of the test that's meant to detect if someone is trying to present themselves in a more positive light than is actually true.
Oh, so it's trying to catch people who are faking good.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that Dr. Qurbanī points out that Iranian patients often score high on this scale, not because they're being intentionally deceptive.
So it's not that they're actually lying.
Not necessarily. It's more about that ingrained sense of social desirability that's very prominent in Iranian culture.
So they might feel pressure to present themselves in a certain way.
Even if it doesn't completely reflect reality.
Which makes sense given that whole idea of tear-off that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It highlights how even these seemingly objective psychological tests can be influenced by cultural factors.
It's a good reminder that you can't just take the results at face value.
You always have to consider the individual's cultural context.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Qurbanī goes on to talk about the connection between repressed emotions and physical illness, the idea of psychosomatic illness.
Right, the mind-body connection.
For those who might not be familiar with that concept, can you elaborate on what he means?
Sure. So psychosomatic illnesses are physical ailments that are thought to be caused or influenced by psychological factors.
Okay, so like stress, anxiety, or repressed emotions could actually manifest as physical symptoms.
Exactly. Dr. Qurbanī emphasizes that how we cope with stress, whether we internalize it, lash out, or remain calm, can have a real impact on our physical health.
Interesting. So it's not just about our mental well-being. It's about how our emotional state can actually show up in our bodies.
Right. And he even cites some research by these guys, Isaac and Grossarth-Matechek.
Okay, I haven't heard of them.
They identified 4 personality types
and
their susceptibility to things like cancer and heart disease based on how they dealt with stress.
Wow, that's fascinating. So like different personality types might be more prone to certain illnesses based on how they handle stress.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point even further, he brings in a story by Rumi.
Oh, the Sufi mystic and poet.
Yes. It's a tale of a king, a lovesick maiden, and a mysterious healer. And what's interesting is Dr. Qurbanī argues that this healer isn't just a human doctor.
Oh, so it's not just a literal story.
It's more symbolic. He sees the healer as an archetype, operating on a divine level.
So it's suggesting that healing goes beyond just the physical realm, like there's a deeper, more spiritual dimension to it.
Exactly. And the fact that the maiden is unaware of her own love until the healer kind of probes her suggests that there are these hidden truths within us that we might not even be conscious of.
And those truths can have a big impact on our well-being.
Absolutely. But here's where the story takes a bit of a dark turn. The king, despite his seemingly grand love for the maiden, actually ends up orchestrating the death of the goldsmith that she secretly loves.
Wow. So even something like love can become destructive if it's not handled in a healthy way.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of our motivations, even when we think they're coming from a good place.
It's easy to get caught up in our own desires and lose sight of what's really important.
Exactly. And this brings us to Dr. Qurbaniy's point about the goldsmith within us all.
I was wondering about that. He's suggesting that we each have a part of ourselves that's drawn to those quick fixes, the instant gratification, the material wealth.
It's that part of us that's easily swayed by the allure of easy solutions.
It's so relatable. We've all fallen prey to that desire for the shortcut, the easy path.
But as Dr. Qurban suggests, those quick fixes often lead to more suffering in the long run.
It's about finding that true fulfillment, not just chasing after those external things.
And then he goes even deeper, talking about the collective unconscious.
He's going beyond Jung's initial ideas.
Yes, he's suggesting that archetypes aren't static, but are these dynamic entities shaped by our interactions and the culture we live in.
So they're not just fixed universal symbols, they actually evolve and change.
Exactly. He uses this really compelling analogy, comparing them to viruses.
Oh, interesting. How so?
They only exist when they infect a host, and they change and mutate depending on the environment they're in.
So the way an archetype like, say, the hero manifests in Iran might be different from how it shows up in another culture.
Precisely. And he gives some great examples from Iranian culture.
Like Imam Hussein and Gugush.
Yeah, he's showing how these figures represent these collective desires and values within that culture.
It's a powerful idea, like our individual psyches are connected to this larger collective psyche.
And that those collective forces have a profound influence on how we feel and behave.
Makes you wonder how much agency we really have if we're so deeply shaped by these cultural forces.
It's a big question.
And it really makes you think about the implications for therapy.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if a therapist isn't aware of those underlying cultural forces
that are shaping their client's worldview,
they're going to miss some really important stuff.
Yeah, crucial pieces of the puzzle.
It's like trying to, I don't know, read a book in a language you don't understand.
You might be able to pick out a few words here and there,
but you're not going to get the nuances.
the deeper meaning.
You could even completely misinterpret the whole thing.
Exactly.
And this is where, like, I think so much of communication is more than just the words themselves.
Oh, absolutely. It's about the context,
The unspoken rules.
all the cultural baggage that we bring to the table.
And that's why Dr. Qurbaniyy also emphasizes the importance of therapists being aware of their own biases.
Because we all have them. I mean, you can't completely erase your own cultural lens.
No, it's impossible.
But you can at least become more conscious of it.
And how it might be coloring your perceptions.
Right. Which actually, speaking of perceptions, brings up another really interesting point that he makes
Oh, what's that?
about the potential dangers of spiritual thinking.
Now, that might seem a bit surprising.
Coming from someone who draws so heavily on Rumi.
A deeply spiritual poet. So he's not dismissing spirituality altogether.
No, not at all.
It sounds like he's cautioning against a certain type of spiritual thinking.
That can sometimes lead to what he calls an intellectual bypassing.
Bypassing of?
Our emotional and psychological issues.
Oh, I see.
It's kind of like using spirituality as a way to avoid dealing with the messy stuff of life.
Instead of facing our problems head on.
We might try to spiritualize them away.
Or use spiritual concepts to justify our, less than ideal behavior.
Exactly. It's a way of abdicating responsibility.
And avoiding that hard work of personal growth.
Right.
And he connects this back to that story of the king and the maiden.
How so?
Well, the king's actions
Even though they're driven by this, kind of twisted love,
are ultimately destructive.
because he's operating from a place of delusion.
He's convinced that he's in the right.
That his love is pure and selfless.
But in reality.
He's blinded by his ego.
And causing a lot of suffering.
Yeah. It's a good reminder to be critical of our own motivations.
Even when we think they're coming from a good place. And to remember that true spirituality.
It's about facing the fullness of our human experience.
All of it.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
With courage and compassion.
Exactly.
So what does all of this mean for us?
You mean, how can we apply these insights to our own lives?
Yeah, whether we're therapists or not.
Well, that's a great question. I think Dr. Qurbanee gives us a few clues.
Like,
Well, he emphasizes becoming aware of our own biases. Recognizing that our worldview is just one perspective among many.
it's like that saying, fish don't know they're in water.
Exactly. We're often so immersed in our own culture that we don't even realize how much it's shaping our thoughts and our perceptions.
So once we're aware of those biases
We can start to question them.
and try to understand the world through other people's eyes.
Right. Which brings us to the importance of dialogue,
True dialogue.
where you're really listening deeply to the other person,
Not just waiting for your turn to talk.
suspending your judgments,
Being open to the possibility of changing your mind.
recognizing that we all have something to learn from each other.
And that those differences, those different perspectives can actually be a source of growth.
Absolutely.
But that's really challenging.
Oh, it can be incredibly difficult, especially when we're faced with viewpoints that we disagree with or even find offensive,
Yeah, it's so much easier to stay in our own echo chambers.
where everyone already agrees with you.
But that doesn't really lead to growth.
It just reinforces those pre-existing biases.
And it prevents us from seeing the full picture. So how do we engage in meaningful dialogue when it's tough?
Well, I think it starts with curiosity, a genuine desire to understand.
Even if you don't agree with the person.
Right. And it's about approaching the conversation with humility,
Recognizing that you might not have all the answers.
being willing to truly listen
Without interrupting.
without planning your rebuttal in your head.
But really, truly trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
Their lived experience.
Because everyone has a story,
And every story has the potential to teach us something.
if we're open to it.
And Dr. Qurbanee also reminds us to be wary of those quick fixes,
The easy answers that promise us happiness.
but don't really deliver.
It's about cultivating a more discerning mind.
Being honest with yourself about your motivations.
It's like that saying, if it sounds too good to be true,
It probably is.
we have to be willing to do the work,
The inner work.
to face our shadows.
And to find true fulfillment.
Not in external things, but
Within ourselves.
that's powerful. It's a call to authenticity.
And self-awareness.
It's a reminder that real growth often involves pain, struggle.
It's not always comfortable.
No, but it's necessary for our evolution as humans.
He even compares it to a kind of death and rebirth.
Oh, how so?
Well, he uses that example of Rumi's story again.
Where the goldsmith has to die.
In order for the maiden to truly be free.
So it's a metaphor for the parts of ourselves that we have to let go of.
To make space for something new.
So it's about letting go of those attachments, beliefs that aren't serving us anymore.
Even if it hurts.
Exactly. It's about trusting the process.
Allowing ourselves to be transformed by our experiences.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And it brings us back full circle to the beginning.
To the importance of cultural understanding.
Because in order to really grow and transform,
We have to be willing to step outside of our own little bubbles.
to encounter different ways of being in the world,
To challenge our assumptions.
and to embrace the vastness of human experience.
And that's really what Dr. Qurbanee's lecture is all about.
It's an invitation to really dive deep
Into the mysteries of the human psyche.
and to explore that fascinating interplay.
Between culture
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
cruelty. Going back to everything we discussed, one thing that really stuck with me was that cautionary note about spiritual thinking.
Yeah,
It is easy to kind of fall into that trap of using spirituality.
almost like a bypass.
Yeah, as a way to bypass that personal growth work.
A way to avoid facing things head on.
Exactly, those less pleasant aspects. I'm sure I've been guilty of it sometimes, like when you try to spiritualize a problem away instead of dealing with it.
Oh, for sure. It's a subtle form of resistance.
Yeah, it is. Like using spiritual ideas to justify behavior that isn't so healthy.
Avoiding responsibility.
And kind of fooling yourself into thinking you're more evolved than you are.
Dr. Qurbanee's insights on this were really insightful.
I agree. True spirituality isn't about escaping reality. It's about fully engaging with it. All the messy parts.
Yeah, all of it.
And doing that hard work of self-discovery. Facing those shadow sides.
And then integrating them. All the parts.
Good, bad, and the ugly.
That's where you find true wholeness. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Into Dr. Qurbanee's lecture.
I want to leave you with a few things to think about.
How can you actually apply this to your own life?
What are some of your own cultural biases? We talked about that a lot.
And are they affecting how you see the world?
How can you have those tough but meaningful conversations with people who are different from you?
And how can you cultivate that true, genuine spirituality,
The kind that doesn't shy away from challenges.
but actually sees them as chances to grow and change?
These are questions we should all be asking,
As we, make our way through this complex world.
trying to become more aware, more compassionate people.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been great exploring these ideas with you,
We hope it's given you food for thought
and that you'll keep exploring this fascinating connection.
between culture, psychology, and spirituality.
Until next time.